Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust, Volume 2 of In Search of Lost Time. So, much like the preceding volume, despite being a big ass book, Within a Budding Grove can be summarized fairly easily. So, um, whereas Swan's Way told of the narrator's childhood, Within a Budding Grove tells of the narrator's adolescence, I believe, and picking up kind of where Swan's Way left off, the narrator has a powerful crush on Gilbert, the daughter of Charles and Odette Swan, whose love story was recounted in the previous volume. And he is really fixated on Gilbert and kind of to an extent her family as well. He really wants to be around them and he really wants to be in their good graces. But alas, Gilbert does not really reciprocate his affections that much, and so eventually he kind of ends up falling out of love with her and kind of eventually just writing her off. But also during this time period, the narrator has decided that he wants to be a writer. That's what he wants to do in life is be a man of letters. But unfortunately, he can't really figure out how to get going on that project, how to really sit down and start writing. He doesn't really know exactly what he's going to write about. But the narrator is also introduced to Monsieur de Norpois, who is an ex French diplomat who is a friend of his father's. And he eventually also makes the acquaintance of Bergot, an author whom he greatly admires. And around this time, the narrator's health unfortunately starts to crap out on him because, much like Marcel Proust, the narrator in this book, is kind of sickly. I mean, it's almost like the narrator is Marcel. So, on doctor's orders, the narrator packs up with his grandmother and their trusty maid Francois, and he goes to spend some time at Balbec, a coastal resort town. And there they meet Madame de Villeparisis. Again, these French names I'm probably just butchering, but I'm trying my best. Anyway, Madame de Villeparisis is like an old friend, I think, of the narrator's grandmother. And there, the narrator meets his friend Block, who is kind of a self deprecating Jewish dickhead, kind of. And he meets Robert de Saint Loup, who is the nephew, or maybe it's like the great nephew. Some of these relations in this book are kind of hard to keep straight. Who's related to whom and how they're related. But anyway, Robert de Saint Loup is some kind of relation. I think it's like the great nephew to Madame de Villeparisis. And he and the narrator kind of become fast friends. Uh, and also, the narrator is introduced to Robert de Saint Loup's uncle, I think, the kind of memorable Baron de Charlus. And then also, the narrator meets a painter named Elsteer, who was actually a very minor background figure in the Swan in Love section of Swan's Way. And then the narrator sees during his stay in this town kind of a girl gang. It's kind of a band of girls who are kind of almost kind of like hooligans a little bit. And of course, it's just love at first sight with the narrator because by this point we've kind of realized that the narrator is just smitten with basically every woman he sees. But so he really sets his sights on this band of girls who are also staying in this town, and one in particular named Albertine, whom he really kind of obsesses over to a degree. And then he eventually makes their acquaintance and kind of tries to put the moves on Albertine, but she kind of rebuffs him. And then the summer ends because they were kind of staying in this town over the summer. It's like a vacation resort thing. Anyway, so the summer ends, the town closes up, and then the narrator has to leave. And that is Within a Budding Grove. Now, how did I respond to Within a Budding Grove? Thank you for asking. I actually really liked this book. In fact, I liked it better than the last book. Swan's Way is kind of the frontispiece of In Search of Lost Time. Like I said in my review of Swan's Way, that's the one that like a lot of people read, and then a lot of people just leave it there and they don't continue on. But if you do continue on, I think you may find that Within a Budding Grove actually surpasses Swan's Way, or at least it certainly did for me. Um, I actually found this book to be much more rich than the previous book, and that's probably because Within a Budding Grove has much more. It has much closer to a traditional plot than Swan's Way. Now, plot, when we're talking about In Search of Lost Time, is pretty scarce. However, um, what's interesting about Within a Budding Grove is that it actually does kind of almost have a like a standard plot. The narrator, because the bulk of the book is about the narrator spending a summer in this town, kind of recuperating because of his ill health, and that kind of sets like it feels like there's a certain window here that we're looking through, and yeah, so this one felt a little bit more structured than the last one, and so I kind of responded well to that. But also, the writing in this is just it's just unfreaking believably good. Like, I mean, this is Proust, so I guess that's just the par for the course is just magnificent prose because it's just as sumptuous and lush as the last book was. Love it. Great writing. But also, in terms of the characters, we start to see a little bit more development on the part of the narrator as he kind of decides on his life's course. He just wants to be a writer. And then also his kind of um, romantic escapades, what have you. So yeah, the characters are good as well, and also the themes of this kind of are feel like a little bit more stark, perhaps. Like with in Swan's Way, we had the episode of the Madeline, which really showed us what In Search of Lost Time was trying to do, and we get more of that in here. So it kind of feels a little bit enhanced from the last book as we're getting more kind of a greater glimpse of what In Search of Lost Time is principally preoccupied with. And so I thought I might read some excerpts out of this because, well, first of all, the writing. I mean, my goodness, you could just read this, and I mean, it's just so beautiful. It feels like it wants to be read aloud. But I thought I'd read some of my favorite passages from this to kind of give an idea of what I like so much about this. And here in the early pages of the book, we get what I think is kind of some witty, um, self-referential kind of almost humor on Proust's part. And in this scene, the narrator is at dinner with Monsieur de Norpois, who is the diplomat guy, and they're discussing the works of the author Bergot, whom the narrator is kind of really a fan of, and whom Norpois really isn't. But anyway, um, uh, Norpois says this, and I feel as though it's with this that Proust is kind of referring to his own work because much of the description here kind of fits with In Search of Lost Time. So it reads, I do not share your son's point of view. Bergot is what I call a flute player. One must admit that he plays very agreeably, although with a great deal of mannerism, of affectation. But when all is said, there's no more to it than that, and that is not much. Nowhere does one find in his flaccid works what one might call structure. No action, or very little, but above all, no range. His books fail at the foundation, or rather, they have no foundation at all. At a time like the present, when the ever increasing complexity of life leaves one scarcely a moment for reading, when the map of Europe has undergone radical alterations and is on the eve, perhaps, of undergoing others more drastic still, when so many new and threatening problems are arising on every side, you will allow me to suggest that one is entitled to ask that a writer should be something more than a clever fellow who lulls us into forgetting amid otiose and Byzantine discussions of the merits of pure form, that we may be overwhelmed at any moment by a double tide of barbarians, those from without and those from within our borders. I am aware that this is to blaspheme against the sacrosanct school of what these gentlemen term art for art's sake. But at this period of history, there are tasks more urgent than the manipulation of words in a harmonious manner. So Norpois is not a fan of Bergot's works because they don't have much structure or action, which is, I mean, that's just a dead ringer for Proust's own books. So I feel as though with that little scene there, Proust is kind of poking fun lightly at his own writing. But then we skip over here a few more pages and we get this scene right here. Bear with me here. That evening, as I waited for the time to arrive when, thanks to the freedom of choice which they allowed me, I should or should not begin to be happy in life, my father's words caused me great uneasiness. His unexpected kindnesses, when they occurred, had always made me long to kiss his glowing cheeks above his beard, and if I did not yield to the impulse, it was simply because I was afraid of annoying him. Now, as an author becomes alarmed when he sees the fruits of his own meditations, which do not appear to him to be of great value, since he does not separate them from himself, oblige a publisher to choose a brand of paper, to employ a typeface finer perhaps than they deserve, I ask myself whether my desire to write was of sufficient importance to justify my father in dispensing so much generosity. But apart from that, in speaking of my inclinations as no longer liable to change, and of what was destined to make my life happy, he aroused in me two very painful suspicions. The first was that at a time when every day I regarded myself as standing upon the threshold of a life which was still intact and would not enter upon its course until the following morning, my existence had already begun, and that, furthermore, what was yet to follow would not differ to any extent from what had gone before. The second suspicion, which was really no more than a variant of the first, was that I was not situated somewhere outside time, but was subject to its laws, just like those characters in novels who, for that reason, used to plunge me into such gloom when I read of their lives down at Cambrai in the fastness of my hooded wicker chair. In theory, one is aware that the earth revolves, but in practice one does not perceive it. The ground upon which one treads seems not to move, and one can rest assured. So it is with time in one's life, and to make its flight perceptible, novelists are obliged, by wildly accelerating the beat of the pendulum, to transport the reader in a couple of minutes over 10 or 20 or even 30 years. At the top of one page we have left a lover full of hope. At the foot of the next we meet him again, a bowed old man of 80, painfully dragging himself on his daily walk around the courtyard of a hospital, scarcely replying to what is said to him, oblivious of the past. In saying of me, he's no longer a child, his tastes won't change now, and so forth, my father had suddenly made me conscious of myself in time, and caused me the same kind of depression as if I had been, not yet the enfeebled old pensioner, but one of those heroes of whom the author, in a tone of indifference which is particularly galling, says to us at the end of a book, he very seldom comes up from the country now. He has finally decided to end his days there. So that was such a great little window, I think, onto what In Search of Lost Time is principally concerned with, which is time, but also the creation of art, perhaps, as a means of defying time and defying um, being forgotten. The narrator now realizes that he is in time. I mean, we all are, but there comes a point where we really feel it, where we're like, oh, every second that passes is, that much more of your life that's gone. The narrator understands now that there's quite literally a ticking clock, and what he wants to do with his life is be a writer, and it's kind of how these things intersect, how they interact with each other, of both the consciousness of the ceaseless passage of time, but also the ambition of the artist, I guess you might say. So I really liked that little section. But then over here, quite a bit through the book. We have what is possibly my favorite instance in this book. This is very strongly harkening back to the episode of the Madeline in the previous book. But I like this more because this is yet another Proustian moment where the narrator is confronted with something which kind of transports them back in time, mentally at least. And this one I actually like more than the Madeline episode in the previous book. So I'll read that here. Bear with me, this one's a little bit longer, but I really do think this demands to be read because this is kind of, I think, the heart of Within a Budding Grove and gives a greater glimpse of um, what Proust is doing with In Search of Lost Time. So we came down toward Hudis, Hudeminil. Again, these French names. Oh my goodness. We came down towards Hudeminil, and suddenly I was overwhelmed with that profound happiness which I had not often felt since Cambrai, a happiness analogous to that which had been given me by, among other things, the steeples of Martinville. But this time it remained incomplete. I had just seen, standing a little way back from the Hog's Back road along which we were traveling, three trees which probably marked the entry to a covered driveway and formed a pattern which I was not seeing for the first time. I could not succeed in reconstructing the place from which they had been, as it were, detached. But I felt that it had been familiar to me once, so that my mind having wavered between some distant year and the present moment, Baalbec and its surroundings began to dissolve, and I wondered whether the whole of this drive were not a make-believe. Baalbec, a place to which I had never gone except in imagination, Madame de Villeparisy, a character in a story, and the three old trees, the reality which one recaptures on raising one's eyes from the book which one has been reading, and which describes an environment into which one has come to believe that one has been bodily transported. I looked at the three trees. I could see them plainly, but my mind felt that they were concealing something which it could not grasp, as when an object is placed out of our reach, so that our fingers, stretching out at arm's length, can only touch for a moment its outer surface without managing to take hold of anything. Then we rest for a little while before thrusting out our arm with renewed momentum and trying to reach an inch or two further. But if my mind was thus to collect itself, to gather momentum, I should have to be alone. What would I not have given to be able to draw aside as I used to do on those walks along the Guermantes Way when I detached myself from my parents? I felt indeed that I ought to do so. I recognize that kind of pleasure which requires, it is true, a certain effort on the part of the mind, but in comparison with which the attractions of the indolence which inclines us to renounce that pleasure seem very slight. That pleasure, the object of which I could only dimly feel, which I must create for myself, I experienced only on rare occasions. But on each of these, it seemed to me that the things that had happened in the meantime were of little importance, and that in attaching myself to the reality of that pleasure alone could I at length begin to lead a true life. I put my hand for a moment across my eyes so as to be able to shut them without Madame de Villeparisis noticing. I sat there thinking of nothing. Then, with my thoughts collected, compressed, and strengthened, I sprang further forward in the direction of the trees, or rather in that inner direction at the end of which I could see them inside myself. I felt again behind them the same object known to me and yet vague, which I could not bring nearer. And yet all three of them, as the carriage moved on, I could see coming towards me. Where had I looked at them before? There was no place near Cambrai where an avenue opened off the road like that, nor was there room for the sight which they recalled to me in the scenery of the place in Germany where I had gone one year with my grandmother to take the waters. Was I to suppose then that they came from years already so remote in my life that the landscape which surrounded them had been entirely obliterated from my memory, and that, like the pages which, with a sudden thrill, we recognize in a book that we imagined we had never read, they alone survived from the forgotten book of my earliest childhood? Were they not rather to be numbered among those dream landscapes, always the same, at least for me, in whom their strange aspect was only the objective objectivation in my sleeping mind of the effort I made while awake, either to penetrate the mystery of a place beneath the outward appearance of which I was dimly conscious of there being something more, as had so often happened to me on the Garamond Way, or to try to put mystery back into a place which I had longed to know, and which, from the day when I had come to know it, had seemed to me to be wholly superficial, like Baalbec. Or were they merely an image freshly extracted from a dream of the night before, but already so warm, so faded, that it seemed to me to come from somewhere far more distant? Or had I indeed never seen them before, and did they conceal beneath their surface, like certain trees on tufts of grass that I had seen beside the Garamond Way, a meaning as obscure, as hard to grasp as is a distant past, so that whereas they were inviting me to probe a new thought, I imagined that I had to identify an old memory? Or again, were they concealing no hidden thought, and was it simply visual fatigue that made me see them double in time as one sometimes sees double in space? I could not tell, and meanwhile they were coming towards me, perhaps some fabulous apparition, a ring of witches or of gnomes who would propound their oracles to me. I chose rather to believe that they were phantoms of the past, dear companions of my childhood, vanished friends who were invoking our common memories. Like ghosts, they seemed to be appealing to me to take them with me, to bring them back to life. In their simple and passionate gesticulation, I could discern the helpless anguish of a beloved person who has lost the power of speech and feels that he will never be able to say to us what he wishes to say, and we can never guess. Presently, at a crossroads, the carriage left them. It was bearing me away from what alone I believed to be true, what would have made me truly happy. It was like my life. That right there, I just absolutely love. Again, it's another Proustian moment of the narrator again being confronted with something that harkens back to something that he had encountered earlier in his life. And we all have those moments, I think, where we again are confronted with something which sparks some kind of dim recollection of something that we had encountered previously in our lives, and that we consciously may not be able to remember, but which is still existent in some deeper part of our being. And I just absolutely love that scene where the narrator sees these trees, and it just kind of overpowers him, this feeling that he's seen something like that before, or maybe dreamt something like that before. But it's so evocative, and he knows that this scene represents something, but he doesn't know quite the nature of that something. That I just found that scene absolutely marvelous. That I think really is the heart of this book, if not the heart, kind of In Search of Lost Time overall. But then finally, the last excerpt I guess I'll read takes place here. In this scene, the narrator is conversing with the painter that I mentioned he meets, named Elsteer, and they're kind of talking about life and art and stuff, which they do kind of a lot in these books, apparently. But the painter says something right here that also I think really strikes at the heart of what these books are all about, but also is something that's I think quite profound and meaningful to everyone, I think. So, there is no man, he began, however wise, who has not at some period of his youth said things or lived a life, the memory of which is so unpleasant to him that he would gladly expunge it. And yet he ought not entirely to regret it, because he cannot be certain that he has indeed become a wise man, so far as it is possible for any of us to be wise, unless he has passed through all the fatuous or unwholesome incarnations by which that ultimate stage must be preceded. I know that there are young people, the sons and grandsons of distinguished men, whose masters have instilled into them nobility of mind and moral refinement from their school days. They may perhaps have nothing to retract from their past lives. They could publish a signed account of everything they have ever said or done. But they are poor creatures, feeble descendants of doctrinaires, and their wisdom is negative and sterile. We do not receive wisdom, we must discover it for ourselves after a journey through the wilderness which no one else can make for us, which no one can spare us, for our wisdom is the point of view from which we come at last to regard the world. The lives that you admire, the attitudes that seem noble to you, have not been shaped by a paterfamilias or a schoolmaster. They have sprung from very different beginnings, having been influenced by everything evil or commonplace that prevailed round about them. They represent a struggle and a victory. I can see that the picture of what we were at an earlier stage may not be recognizable and cannot certainly be pleasing to contemplate in later life. But we must not repudiate it, for it is a proof that we have really lived, that it is in accordance with the laws of life and of the mind that we have from the common elements of life, the life of studios, of artistic groups, assuming one is a painter, extracted something that transcends them. That, again, I love that passage right there because that also really gets at the heart of what Proust's mission with these books, I think, is that throughout our lives, via our experiences, we are created. I mean, we are the sum of all of the things that have happened to us in life, and not all of those things are positive, and a lot of them are things that we probably blush to remember and would rather not have happened. But what the painter is saying is that don't be ashamed of those things, but rather learn from those and recognize that everything that's happened to you is something that can offer you perspective. And that's what I think. I mean, I'm only on the second book, but I think that that's kind of what In Search of Lost Time is about. It's about remembering our past and analyzing it and coming to understand ourselves better by understanding the nature of our own experiences and sensations. So I really did find Within a Budding Grove to be a much more rich and kind of stimulating experience than I found Swan's Way. And I really liked Swan's Way unexpectedly, but this book really kicked it up a notch. And so to rate Within a Budding Grove, I'm going to give this book an A. I gave Swan's Way, I think, an A minus. So this one, bumping the rating to up a notch to an A. Maybe not quite a perfect score, A plus, because these books do drag. They do. I mean, a lot of these books are very, very tedious at times as we get so much minutia and stuff that's just seemingly inconsequential. But I think the overall point is that nothing is inconsequential. That every little thing that happens to us has some kind of import. And so that doesn't mean that it's necessarily fun to read. So again, it does drag, but I think I'm starting to see what Proust is doing with these books. And this one, again, um, I found much more enjoyable than the previous. So yeah, to rate Within a Budding Grove, this one gets an A. So Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Have you read Within a Budding Grove, or have you read In Search of Lost Time in its entirety? If you have, be sure to let me know down in the comments what you thought, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And if you haven't read Within a Budding Grove or just In Search of Lost Time more broadly, this book was rewarding, as I hope I have well evinced. This one was really rewarding. I liked it better than the previous book. However, I don't know that I can say that I would recommend this because in order to get to this book, you're going to have to read the previous book. And while I said with Swan's Way, that can be read like as a standalone, this one cannot. You won't. You have to read Swan's Way before you read this one, or else you'll just be lost as to the characters. So I guess I can't say that I'll just recommend this one as much as I did like it because again you got to know you got to know you're in it for at least some kind of long haul when you're tackling these books. But this book I really did like. I liked it better than Swan's Way, and yeah, so I'm still hooked for the rest of In Search of Lost Time. I'm still committed. So yeah, as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.